Hello and welcome everyone to Fuel Poverty Action's series of monthly learning sessions. Fuel for Thoughts, from fuel poverty to climate justice. If you don't know about Fuel Poverty Action, we're a group of ordinary people who are fed up with being robbed by greedy energy companies through spiraling bills and rip-off prepayment meters, amongst many other rip-offs from our energy system. We campaign to protect people from fuel poverty. We challenge rip-off energy companies and unfair policies that leave people to endure cold homes. And we take action for warm, well-insulated homes and clean and affordable energy that's under the control of people and communities, not private companies. And Fuel for Thought, this space in which we're in, is our space to share research and lived experience, tackle lies and clear up confusion as we ask and answer questions with experts, activists, and campaigners. Today, we are going to be talking about AI and their associated data centers, and how, and the serious concerns that, these structures that are being built raise for our household bills, our resource use, and also what that means for our environment and climate change. We've got three brilliant speakers tonight, the first of which is Anisa Khan, who is Global Action Plan's Parliamentary Campaigns Manager. Anisa leads the organization's political engagement on data centers, and is going to give us, I think, a pretty thorough introduction of the subject and also what Global Action Plan is doing to challenge data centers being built in the UK. Anisa, as promised, I'm going to bring up your slides.
Thank you, that's brilliant. While you're just getting that up, I'll say who I am and who Global Action Plan are. So as Amal said, I am Anisa, and I am the Parliamentary Campaigns Manager at Global Action Plan, leading on the political engagement and political campaigning across our work. I'm going to share some information on data centres and the harm they're causing, some of the political developments in the area, campaigning we're doing to limit the rollout, and how you can get involved or work with us. So Global Action Plan is a UK climate charity. We work on big tech, clean air, and climate education. And data centres aren't new. They've been needed for processing data for decades, from phone calls to Zoom meetings. However, what is new is the sheer scale and volume of their build-out, function, and environmental impact, which warrants urgent investigation. Next slide, please. So this is an image of the proposed data centre in Blyth, Northumberland. Sorry, has the next slide moved for anyone else? Perfect. Back one. So data centres are buildings full of servers that run 24/7 and use a huge amount of electricity and water for cooling. More than 100 hyperscale data centres are planned or under construction in the UK, without consideration of the societal and environmental harms they'll cause. Data centres have enormous resource demand. They impact local water availability and national power consumption, affecting our ability to move to clean power by 2030. Next slide, please. So according to the International Energy Agency, a typical AI-focused data centre consumes as much electricity as 100,000 households. But the largest ones under construction today will consume 20 times as much. Energy demands of data centres are rising at an unpredictable rate. We saw figures this week suggesting data centres are requesting more additional electricity than the current UK peak demand. Data centre developers claim there's nothing to worry about and their developments will use renewable power. But big tech's claims about climate benefits of AI are also a hoax, as demonstrated in the big tech greenwashing report that came out this week, with 74% of claims about AI's climate benefits being unproven. Next slide, please. Due to their high levels of electricity use, data centres will be responsible for a significant increase in carbon emissions. Emissions from just 10 planned UK data centres will wipe out this year's CO2 savings from the switch to EVs. Data centres also have diesel backup generators for if the grid goes down, and these generators are routinely tested, impacting air pollution. Next slide, please. We've also seen the pace of AI data centre demand outstripping supply of renewables and grid connections. And industry has responded to this by calling for gas generation on site. This will undermine progress on emissions reductions. Next slide, please. Just as the electricity demand is concerning, so is the water impact of data centres. The cheapest and widest adopted way of cooling the hot air coming off packed servers is through heat exchangers filled with mains water. Some is recycled, but most is evaporated. This image shows where data centres are planned in comparison to water scarcity. Most development is planned where water supply is most stressed, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Water has called for a moratorium on new data centres. Many water companies claim they don't know how much water they supply data centres, and developers do not disclose this. And this really requires urgent investigation. Next slide, please. As well as concerns about energy and water use of data centres, there's a concern about housing, and this is because of a competition for grid connections and data centres causing house building to be delayed as a result, as displayed in West London. As well as this, in areas where data centres are being proposed, local people living there want social housing instead, for example in Tower Hamlets on the Truman Brewery site. Next slide, please. As energy bills climb for ordinary citizens, data centres are being offered discounted rates as they stack up demand from an already overstretched electricity grid facing an immense challenge to decarbonise. Local communities are rising up against the loss of local green space, air pollution and nature, as previously untouched sites are earmarked for these huge infrastructure developments. We're working with groups in Potters Bar, North Ockington, Hillingdon, Iver and Brook Lane. Some of these activists joined us outside the Royal Courts of Justice last month on the day of our court case, and you can see them in this picture. Next slide, please. So on to our legal challenge. Foxglove and Global Action Plan launched the UK's first legal challenge to a hyperscale data centre in Buckinghamshire, focusing on the government's failure to properly consider the energy use and environmental impact of a new data centre. The government wrote to us formally to accept that its decision to grant permission for the data centre should be quashed. Lawyers for the government admitted that they failed to put in place measures to ensure the developer and future operator would be held to the commitments they made on mitigating the data centre's climate impact. This came prior to us bringing the decision to approve the data centre to a planning appeal at the High Court on the 22nd of January, in which the developer decided to continue presenting its legal argument, despite the government conceding that the decision was wrong. So at the hearing, we were successful on all grounds, meaning that we have an opportunity to argue our case in full trial. Next slide, please. There's a growing political awareness and concern about the rapid rollout of data centres and how these conflict with our climate targets, as well as our political commitments. We've seen concern come from the GLA around house building and pressures on the grid and the out-of-date grid infrastructure. As well as this, Toby Perkins, the MP and chair of an influential select committee, has raised these concerns with Ed Miliband on the emission of data centres from the carbon budget to ask that it include the levels of energy used by data centres. There are also a number of parliamentary questions being asked about data centres and AI, both in the House of Commons and House of Lords. And the UK government is introducing a national policy statement for data centres to streamline the planning process, with an upcoming consultation expected this month. Next slide, please. So here's a map on our website showing where planned data centres are. And if there's a data centre plan near you, please get in touch and we can send you resources or link you up to people campaigning nearby. It's really vital that we mobilise and highlight the risks that the rollout of data centres pose before it's too late. We're campaigning for the government to implement a framework setting out how many data centres are needed, where, what for, the acceptable limit of environmental harm they cause, and how they'll mitigate this harm. We're also calling for industry to report transparently on its power and water usage. And in lieu of these two things, we want a pause on the construction of new AI data centres. Next slide, please. We have some days of action taking place next week. This will be the first day of action on data centres in the UK, and we really hope that it's the start of something much bigger. So please join us on the 27th and 28th of February to take action to oppose the unchecked expansion of hyperscale AI data centres across the UK. There'll be a list up of events that groups are organising that will be shared on our mailing list, but we would also love people to do things digitally, so please don't stress if you can't get to an event or there isn't one near you. We'll give some prompts for you to post, so again, please reach out and keep an eye on our social media to repost it. You can sign up via MailChimp, which hopefully I will put in the chat after this, or you can email my colleague Owen, who is coordinating this. I'll pop his email in the chat too. And if you have any questions for us, or there are ways that you'd like to mobilise or things that you would like to learn more about, we're really, really keen to hear from you and get the ball rolling on things before it's too late. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks so much for that, Anissa. That was brilliant. Great presentation. Just for everyone else in the room, Anissa is going to be around only for a little bit of our conversation. So if you have some questions that you'd like to direct to her before she has to go at 7:30, maybe just pop them in the chat so we can get to them first, after we've heard from Mary and Andrew. And up next, we've got Mary Dickinson, who's the lead campaigner for the Stop Burning Trees Coalition, who's going to talk to us about the proposed Drax data center and its implications for the survival of what is the UK's single largest emitter. Mary, thanks so much for being with us this evening.
Awesome, thank you so much for having me. Right, hopefully you can all see my screen. Excellent, after a really good start. Yeah, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about the UK's biggest carbon emitter and how they're getting into the data centre business. So just for anyone who's, so to start with, my name's Mary, I work for the Stop Burning Trees Coalition, and we're currently campaigning against proposed data centres built by Drax, powered by burning trees. So for anyone who's sort of not aware, Drax Power Station in Yorkshire is the UK's single biggest carbon emitter. It's the former coal burning power station, which then converted to burning woody biomass, or known as trees, which is currently counted as a renewable form of energy in our country. Drax gets subsidies to the tune of about £2 million a day to do this under renewable energy subsidies. Those subsidies were due to expire in 2027. Last year, they got extended from 2027 to 2031. However, Drax's generating capacity has been capped at about half of what it is currently. And it almost goes without saying, but I will, the burning of woody biomass for energy causes huge amounts of damage to forests. Drax has been repeatedly exposed for sourcing from and burning primary forests, old growth forests from British Columbia, forests from biodiversity hotspots in North America and in Europe, causing huge amounts of harm to community with the production of these pellets, because that production is incredibly polluting leading to the emission of pollutants which link to cancer, asthma, heart disease, and these pellet production sites are primarily located in rural, low-income Black communities in the southern US. And of course, the amount of damage it does to wildlife. But nonetheless, we continue to subsidise this as a form of green energy. However, under the new subsidy arrangement, Drax, it will be making a lot less money. And so last year we saw a joint bid come out from Drax, the University of York, and the York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority to build a Drax-powered AI growth zone at Drax Power Station, which would be a 600 megawatt AI data centre, which is far, far bigger than any of the data centres we currently have in the UK. And this has a few different partners. The University of York and Combined Authority are the main ones, but other partners include the University of Sheffield, the University of Hull, and Selby College, all coming together to make a bid for this AI growth zone. And the reasoning behind this is multifaceted, but fundamentally, Drax's tree burning business is falling apart. Data centres offer a lifeline to polluters, a way for them to keep emitting, to keep burning trees, to keep making money off their dirty energy. And alongside the AI growth zone, Drax has also just begun the planning process to build a 100 megawatt data centre at their site in Selby, which initially would be connected to the grid rather than directly powered by Drax, although they are considering options to then expand to a 1 gigawatt data centre directly powered by Drax in the future. And with the AI growth zone and our interactions with the Mayor of York and North Yorkshire, has basically said that, yeah, he recognises there are issues with Drax. They're planning on building data centres anyway, so they may as well be part of it. And there's also the fact that hosting data centres will give Drax more leverage to demand subsidies to build bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, known as BECCS, from the government. And so this whole proposal from Drax around the data centres is a desperate attempt to keep making more money, but it's also just completely shrouded in greenwashing. Because woody biomass is currently counted as zero carbon, it means Drax and their partners can brand the proposed data centre as powered by renewable energy, despite the fact that woody biomass is just as, if not more, polluting than coal. And throughout their bid, or the executive summary of it, they have constant references to how it would be powered by renewable energy by Drax, and marketing it as having the potential to be the world's first carbon negative data centre. And the idea behind that is if you add carbon capture to Drax's tree burning, because it's already zero carbon, if you capture the carbon emissions, it then becomes carbon negative and can be used to offset other harder to abate sectors, which is completely absurd, but it's nonetheless what's being pushed by Drax and some of their partners. And so currently, Drax burns about 7 million tonnes of wood pellets a year, which should be halving in 2027. However, analysis by the Natural Resource Defence Council found that the data centre, the AI growth zone one, if it goes ahead, could burn almost 2.5 million tonnes of wood per year by 2030 and almost 5 million tonnes per year after that. And even if you use more conservative estimates, using some of Drax's figures, they're still huge numbers. We're still talking about 1.7 million tonnes of wood per year by 2030 and 3.4 million tonnes per year after that. Which means if this data centre goes ahead, it will mean Drax is burning just as much, if not more, wood than it was. And so hopefully you can all see on the slide this very helpful infographic provided by Drax themselves of what this 600 megawatt data centre is the equivalent of, which is 210 shopping malls, 1.56 million households energy usage, 1.48 billion electric cars, and so on. So we are talking about a huge amount of energy to power this AI data centre, which would just lead to huge amounts more forest loss, communities being polluted, and of course, ever higher carbon emissions. So there's the aspect of greenwashing, but there's also the aspect that's being pushed by politicians, both in government and more regionally, that data centres offer a very convenient narrative around growth and jobs. If you read the Drax bid executive summary, they'll talk about having the ability to attract investment, stimulate innovation, creating a pipeline of over 1,000 high-value so-called green jobs in AI engineering, data centre, and environmental analytics. Drax has also separately claimed that this 100 megawatt powered data centre that would be connected to the grid initially could protect 2,500 jobs in Yorkshire. Meanwhile, we have David Scaife, the Mayor of York and North Yorkshire and head of the Combined Authority, claiming if their bid is successful, they could unlock £85 billion worth of growth across Yorkshire. And these are huge claims that are being pushed out with very little scrutiny. And there was some analysis done by Food and Water Watch in Virginia of data centers there, and it's one of the biggest data center capitals of the world, that found for one permanent job to be created by data centers, it costs $13 million, which is an insane amount of money to be creating a tiny, tiny amount of jobs. And there's very little information about how many jobs could actually come from this AI growth zone, but nonetheless, that is the narrative being pushed by parts of our politicians and the idea of creating economic growth without really talking about the fact of who's actually profiting from that. And it's usually the big tech companies and the polluters, not the people. And we're also seeing that Drax has already cut 100 jobs across the UK and the US a few months back. They're currently consulting on cutting 350 jobs, which is 10% of their workforce. So the idea that Drax is doing this because they want to bring jobs to the region is just ludicrous. It's not something they care about. It's just a politically salient talking point to justify them continue polluting and continuing making money off their dirty energy for shareholders. And so I guess that brings us to a sort of whistle-stop tour of the issues with the Drax data center. But it also, the fact is, Drax is doing this because their business is falling apart, because the politicians across party, our media, and just the public see how absurd Drax's business model is, and they're desperately trying to do anything they can to continue clinging on and making money. And so there's quite a few key leverage points that we can be putting pressure on from Drax's partners, particularly the universities and their reputation, because partnering with a company that is polluting poor Black communities in the southern US in the name of a green future and innovation doesn't stack up to anyone, let alone the destruction of primary and old growth forest to power it. There's nothing that could ever be green about what Drax is doing. And then also on the York and North Yorkshire Combined Authority, we know that there are people within it that aren't that happy about it. So continuing to exert pressure on Drax's partners is a really key leverage point for us to be taking action. And then also on the government, because the government firstly decides which areas are selected for AI growth zones, and under new subsidy arrangements from 2027, Drax has to get permission from the government to directly power a data centre. So creating that pressure alongside all of the pressure that needs to be created around data centres more broadly, with Drax is just a really grim example of what polluters are doing, is a really key moment to be doing that. And then, of course, there's just protesting Drax, making sure that that company cannot hide from people, it cannot hide behind its greenwashing and its lies, and the fact that we're all being forced to subsidise this through our energy bills. Drax is designated as critical national infrastructure. We've seen over the past few years Drax responding very negatively and very heavy-handedly to anyone trying to shine a light on what they're doing. But that doesn't mean that protest is impossible, and it doesn't mean that action is impossible. And there are people day in, day out taking action against Drax, whether that's at their offices, at their AGM, or all the infrastructure that exists to support them, from their lobbyists to their insurers to their banks, and most particularly to the government, because fundamentally Drax couldn't survive without all the money that we're all forced to give them. So I'm going to post some links in the chat of different digital actions you can take and ways to get involved with the coalition. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mary. Brilliant. Yeah, and yeah, look out for those links that Mary just posted in the chat. Next up, we're going to hear from Andrew Boswell, who's a former Green Party councillor and energy expert who campaigns against the government's carbon capture and storage plans. He's going to speak a little bit about wider energy implications of data centers for our energy system and also household bills. Take it away, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Amal. Just to introduce myself, as Amal said, I've campaigned against government's carbon capture and storage plans for a long time, including two legal cases against a carbon capture and gas project in Teesside, Net Zero Teesside, which I'll mention a bit more. Those were last year. I'm really pleased to be able to come here tonight and talk about data centers, but it will be a bit through a sort of carbon capture and storage and carbon budget and sort of government approach. And I hope actually that really fits in with what we've heard from Anissa and Mary already, and I think it will. Um, so just to a background to the sort of electricity used by data centers. Effectively, a data center, as we're seeing them coming forward for AI applications and so on, are using a continual industrial baseload. In other words, they're running 100% of the time. So they need electricity 24/7. So this is actually when you have the comparison of 100,000 homes or whatever, and going to 2 million homes in the largest data center. So I was interested actually in that comparison, whether that actually took into account that the data center's running the whole time, or whether it's more the actual electricity used by households when a lot of the time households aren't actually using electricity. But anyway, I don't know the answer to that. But the key point is that that electricity load can't be rescheduled out of the times where you have what I'd call sort of bad weather for electricity renewable generation, which is where you've got low wind or low light for solar. Those sort of times are the sort of crunch point we're coming to with decarbonising the electricity sector. And what we're seeing with data centres is that that's going to basically throw out the plans. And that's what I'm going to try and explain. So in the UK, data centre usage as it ramps up will essentially mean that the UK will be forced to use more gas electricity for generation at times of high demand and where there's low renewables in the system. And that will have two effects, I think, primarily. One is the effect which has been talked about, a bit about the backup diesel generators. And that's been highlighted actually in Virginia in the US, where they call it Data Center Alley. And campaigners there have highlighted that there's something like already 9,000 diesel generators to back up the data centers in that area. And initially, when they went through the US planning system or whatever, the developers were sort of saying, well, these diesel generators, you'll only be switched on very occasionally when there's been some sort of major outage. But what's actually happening in practice is that these diesel generators are being used for whatever reasons more often than just sort of emergency outage, and it's actually causing an air pollution problem in the area. And I think that was an issue also with the one at Blythe in Northumberland, with up to 600 diesel generators proposed, backup proposed for that. And you can imagine they're not going to put in these massive amounts of costly diesel generators if they're not going to use them. So that's the first point, the backup diesel generators. But the second point about the the electricity generation forcing the system into unexpected places is basically, I think it will force power plants which have been put forward to be what's called dispatchable. I'll explain what that means in a minute. And that includes DRACs, which you've just heard about, but also a lot of the carbon capture plants coming forward, and like Net Zero Teesside, which is gas plus CCS system. It will force those power plants to operate outside what they were designed to, which is the dispatchable mode. Now, what dispatchable means is that when there's no renewables available or less renewables available, that these plants are designed to switch in then in a dispatchable mode, and they're never expected to be used more than about 10 to 30% of the time. So that would be DRACs with biomass and CCS after 2031. And it would be Net Zero Teesside, which is a gas powered fire station with CCS. It's not meant to be used more than 30% of the time, but you can imagine with the increasing demand from data centers on the system that they will get pushed into being used more. And what we may see also is standalone commercial contracts specifically for data centers. So with the Drax one, Mary said Drax has got this new subsidy, which it's limited to 27% of use of load use in the system. What we may well see there to enable it to be a data center provider is that you'll have contracts outside the government subsidy scheme, private contracts with data center providers. And I think that's a high risk with Drax. And I think it's a high risk with any of the carbon capture systems being brought forward. So that's schemes like Net Zero Teesside. Net Zero Teesside is the only one being built at the moment. So taking that a bit further forward, there's an organisation called NESO, which basically came out of the National Grid, and it's a bit like the Climate Change Committee. It gives advice to the government. It actually is owned by the government, so it's sort of like a bit like a government department. But in my view, it actually gives its analysis is good in the sense that it actually analyses things fairly well, because basically at the end of the day, they've got to keep the electricity and gas systems going. And their latest report, which is Future Energy Scenarios 2025, basically said at the moment there's 2.4 gigawatts of data center capacity, and that's being actually used 7.6 terawatt hours a year. And it's the terawatt hours per year, which is the key figure. That's how much electricity it's using per hour added up over the whole year. And what they're saying is against that 7.6 terawatt hours now, there could be an additional 12 terawatt hours by 2030. But it ramps up much more to 2035, a total up to 41 terawatt hours. And by 2050, 71 terawatt hours. And that would mean that data centers are somewhere between 5 to 14% of total electricity in the UK. And there'd be something like a quarter of industrial electricity demand. And a quarter of industrial electricity demand by 2035. So I put out a lot of numbers there, which you may not have followed completely, but ask me again later if they're not entirely clear. But basically what that means is a huge amount of extra demand on top of everything like electric vehicles and heat pumps and all the other electrification going on, industrial electrification as well, which actually is really important because industrial electrification moves industry away from gas. So what you've got is a number of things which are demanding electricity, and data centers is now just surging into that space as another one. And it's going to throw all the balancing in the electricity system effectively. So what is the impact of the extra electricity demand from data centers? Well, as I've already said, I think it will force new gas-fired power stations like Net Zero Teesside and power stations like BECCS to run at much higher load than expected. It may also force them to run without carbon capture because the demand may be so high the government will do something to say, okay, these ones, they may be carbon capture ready, but we can't wait for that. So we'll let them run without carbon capture. Further, all of this needs heavy subsidies. All of these things like carbon capture plants, new gas stations, BECCS, they all depend on very heavy subsidies. There's already £50 billion worth of subsidies allocated to CCS, and £23 billion of it have already been awarded. So, and the Committee on Climate Change say that CCS may cost up to 400 billion by 2050. So that is actually a huge opportunity cost um, on all the things I was just mentioning, like electrification by EVs, electrification by heat pumps, also things like insulation in households. The government haven't got the money to do all those things. They're putting it into subsidies for CCS, and data centers may drive higher subsidies for CCS and higher subsidies for tracks. That means less money for all the good stuff we need to do for climate change: electrification of households, electrification of transport. It cuts possible grants to households. It cuts insulation and grants for insulation. So that's where it fits in with the fuel poverty space, and where it's going to have a knock-on impact across the system. So we're going to see less money for consumer electrification, as I said, less money for insulation, less money for renewables. So how does all this fit in with the Committee on Climate Change seventh carbon budget? I was actually really pleased to see Anissa say that Toby Perkins, who's the chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, has written to Ed Miliband about this, because I was just looking through the um, transcripts of the Environmental Audit Committee, and they did an inquiry into the seventh carbon budget, and data centres was hardly mentioned, but there was one question on it. So maybe Toby Perkins picked up on that. But more than that, the Committee on Climate Change in their seventh carbon budget make absolutely no mention of AI data centres. And this was only published last year, this report. I was absolutely amazed in preparing for this to find that the Committee on Climate Change had just not mentioned it. And then when it was raised as a question in the Environmental Audit Committee, the response was, well, the Committee on Climate Change hadn't actually included data centres in their modelling. So you have to ask, how on earth are we going to get a balanced seventh carbon budget which is deliverable? I think it's a huge, huge issue, and the government is due to set the seventh carbon budget in June 2026. So they've had the advice from the Committee on Climate Change. They're going to get a report from the Environmental Audit Committee very soon. What's going to happen next? And I think that's a place where campaigns can come in. And my interest in litigation, I think there's pinch points in how the government set the seventh carbon budget report, which are worth looking at. They're going to have to publish an impacts assessment when they table the seventh carbon budget report. And I think we should all be looking at that and looking how they're saying the impact of data centres are going to impact delivery of the seventh carbon budget. And in fact, it's not just data centres, of course, it's also how carbon capture and so on is going to, because carbon capture is a net positive. It's not a net negative as they'd like people to think. It's actually a net negative. And there's also an issue here with wider global climate, in that gas-fired carbon capture and storage and Drax or Drax running Drax have a lot of hidden emissions. Mary's already mentioned that the burning of wood at Drax is zero rated as far as the carbon budgets and so on is concerned. It's a total disgrace. Lots of people are now calling it out. Drax is actually the biggest polluter of CO2 in the UK. That's unaccounted for in the carbon budgets and so on. And but more on the global carbon budgets, those are upstream emissions, and the gas and carbon capture ones, the upstream emissions are very, very high from methane. And methane is a climate accelerator. It's a short-term climate change gas. It has its impacts in the first 20 years after it's emitted. And at the moment, it's accelerating climate change as we're speaking. And if we have more data centers requiring more gas CCS, we're going to be accelerating methane out there in the global atmosphere. And that's not being looked at by anybody, except I'm trying to raise it through various things through the legal system and through planning inquiries at the moment. So those are some of the knock-on effects. Is there any ray of hope? Well, rays of hope. 2 data centers have just failed in planning due to, and Anissa talked about the one from Global Action Plan and Foxglove. Brilliant case, and thank you very much for that. But the key thing there was that there's no EIA and no greenhouse gas assessment. That was the Ivor Bucks one, a 90 megawatt one, but also an Edinburgh one was just turned down February the 5th, I think. So this was the one with 600 diesel generators. I was wrong there. It wasn't Blythe. Got my notes muddled. But the Edinburgh Gyle one had 600 diesel generators as well, which is a big air pollution problem. But it also didn't have a greenhouse gas assessment. So, and that one has been turned down because it didn't have a greenhouse gas assessment by a planning committee in Edinburgh. So that's brilliant news that the greenhouse gas emissions are beginning to come up the agenda a bit, and these planning decisions are being challenged. As I say, I think the huge campaign opportunity in the next 4 months before the government sets the 7th carbon budget in June is to raise this and continually, ask scrutinizing questions of how they are going to balance the 7th carbon budget, and that means the 5th and 6th ones leading up to the 7th carbon budget, if they're going to roll out all the data centers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Andrew. Brilliant contribution. I've noticed lots of questions already coming into the chat. Please, and links as well, please keep them coming. Really good to see how much conversation is bringing up. And about those questions, I've noticed a couple about heat networks that have come up. And we have someone in the room who can definitely address those. I believe we have Stephen Knight, who's the Chief Executive of the Heat Trust, who's an independent non-profit consumer champion for heat networks in Great Britain. Stephen, would you be able to give us talk to us for just a few minutes about heat networks and how the issues that are being talked around data centers? That'd be brilliant.
Oh, I'm unmuted. Excellent. Thank you, Amal. That's for that introduction. Yeah. So I run Heat Trust, which is the national consumer protection system for people on heat networks. So we're a sort of consumer champion for people on heat networks. And you're quite right. Data centers are being talked about at the moment as a potential heat source for district heating systems, because whilst obviously a lot of the electricity is used for the data processing itself, there's a lot of waste heat generated by this process that's not 100% efficient. I think that is problematic for all sorts of reasons. Partly the things that have been discussed, if they will generate a lot more demand for electricity, which of course will push up consumer prices for electricity. Particularly at a time when we don't have enough renewable and other zero carbon electricity sources, including nuclear. Actually, as a heat source for a district heating system, data centers are not particularly attractive, or they are being used in 1 or 2 cases. One of the main concerns from a kind of consumer perspective of the heat is that a data center, like any IT project, is not necessarily going to remain the same in 20, 30 years' time. Whereas if you want a heat source for a district heating scheme, you really want consistency very long term, because you want to know it's going to be providing, heating those homes for decades, ideally. And a data center could well change. The needs, the technology around AI could well be different in 10 years' time than it is now, and therefore building a whole housing development that relies on heat from a particular data center, which might move, or it might change in its technology and so on, and therefore not provide the heat. But I think fundamentally, it's where is the energy going to come from? Because this is not free heat from a data center, it's coming from the use of a heck of a lot of electricity. And that same electricity, as I think a lot of the speakers have said, could generate a lot more heat if they were used to drive heat pumps. It's another kind of demand for electricity. It's a demand for electricity that's fairly consistent across the year, in the winter when we don't have much solar, at times when there's no wind, so we'll kind of push up demand for fossil fuels. There has been some talk about using nuclear power to drive data centers, particularly the small modular reactors. But the reality is data centers are being built now, and the small modular reactors are not ready. They're not being rolled out. There's a first pilot planned in perhaps 10 to 15 years time. So it's very much a case of, we're going to build this thing now that's going to consume lots of electricity, and we have this plan for some future technology which isn't yet with us that's going to solve the problem, which we've seen a lot of in terms of climate problems up until now. And frankly, even if we did have lots of capacity to put in place lots of new small nuclear reactors to power these data centers, frankly, you'd be much better off taking the heat directly from the nuclear power station than you would via the data center if you wanted to drive district heat, because actually nuclear reactors are going to be there for 30 years reliably and would provide you a much more reliable source of heat. So from a heat draw perspective, you'd be far better off taking the heat directly from that than via a data center. But I think the real problem is, we don't currently have enough renewable electricity for the purposes that we're trying to use it for at the moment, in terms of transport, in terms of heat, in terms of just powering our everyday needs, industry, etc. And this obviously is yet another big demand for electricity, and that means that if there isn't enough renewable, it'll be fossil fuels ultimately, or biomass, and all the problems associated with that, as we heard earlier. So I think that's what I have to say. I don't think, I think data centers are being talked about in the district heat world as a great new source of heat, but I'm not sure from a consumer perspective that makes any sense really when you think about the energy demands. That would be my take. That's helpful.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Yeah, that is very helpful. Great to have you here. And if you're able, please do stick around until 8 whilst we have a conversation. And in case anyone wants to ask more questions about heat networks. It is now time to move into the discussion part of the session, where I hand over to everyone else that's here tonight for your comments, questions, clarifications, and also just your own thoughts, your own contributions. If you'd like to come in, please raise your virtual hand. You can do that by clicking on the little on the reaction button in the Zoom. Is it that one? Oh God, to really know this part now. Yeah, there's a little reaction button, and you can raise your hand. But first, there were a few questions for Anissa that people put in the chat from earlier. So I'm going to come to those first. Has there been a question from Ruth? Has there been an attempt to site data centers near wind and solar farms? A question from Dominic: are these data centers for US-based companies, not just UK-based companies? And a question from Andrea: if anyone knows anything about trade union views and action on these issues. Yeah, Anissa, if you're happy to start us off, and then maybe if anyone else also has anything to say on these questions, it'd be great to hear as well. Anissa's still with us. Okay. It seems like Anissa has already left, unfortunately, which I'm only just noticing now. But does anyone have anyone want to come in on these three questions then? Either uh, Andrew or Mary or Stephen as well. No. Has there been any attempt to site data centers near wind and solar farms? Do we know?
Hello. I mean, there are people with their hands up. I don't know if you can't see them.
Oh yeah, I can, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, I think we will just go to Ellen and Dave. Ellen, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I came in very late, so I don't know what I've missed. But just on, I mean, I don't know is the answer to that first question. But from the way I think about it, it's irrelevant because, if you have a data center being powered by a wind farm or a solar farm, why isn't that energy being used efficiently to decarbonize our homes and our transport system and our industry, rather than being used extremely inefficiently to power something that, by and large, we don't actually need, or we certainly don't need it at that kind of scale. So actually what it's doing is undermining the entire decarbonisation project, which I think is, being made very clear by what we've heard already, from where I came in anyway, it was being made clear by the speakers. Just on the trade unions, I mean, I think trade unions are worried about AI generally, not necessarily from a climate change perspective or from an energy prices, energy costs perspective, although some obviously will be, but partly because of the content, the product of what's being produced. AI is the fear that it's going to displace jobs. We've spoken to somebody who, for example, is an actor who's talking about the way that images, things are being generated that displace skilled acting, stuff like that. But but that is the case in just about every sector. And I think what we heard on Tuesday in the campaign against climate change meeting, which was sort of complementary to this, three different speakers, that it's like lots of other stuff. It's like the carbon capture and storage stuff as well that some of us have been looking at, that it's touted as, oh, it's going to protect jobs, it's going to be good for employment. There's no evidence for that whatsoever, and if anything, the reverse. But actually running the things is going to use virtually no labour, absolutely minimal labour, which is often the case with these big infrastructure projects anyway. You need labour to build them, but you don't need labour to run them. So I think that if the unions should be very worried about it all, if they're not, but I think they are for a whole range of different reasons.
Thanks a lot, Alan. Dave, you want to come in?
Hiya, can you hear me? Yeah, all right.
Yes.
Oh, you can hear me. Yeah, I'm just really worried about the lack of understanding that our political people have on this. I was talking, as I put in the chat the other week, I was talking to some councillors, and they're really excited about AI data centres and this, that, and the other, because they said, well, it'll help power all the homes in the town for the heating for all vulnerable people, because that's what they've been told. And I tried to explain that is a bit rubbish, and they wouldn't have it. So I don't know where they're getting their information from, but wherever they're getting it from, it's really worrying, and it's really concerning that this information is going to people that are going to be making these decisions and approving these planning applications and things like that. and that is really, really worrying. And another thing that I was concerned about is the impact on the grid at the moment. It's already at breaking point, isn't it? The grid. I mean, we've had our centre retrofitted with solar array and things like that, and the solar panels got installed in August last year, and they still ain't been connected because the grid ain't ready for them. So what's going to happen when all these power hungry data centers come on? What's going to happen about the warmer homes plan and people who want to connect up to the grid with solar panels and things like that? Is it going to affect all of that? Is it going to affect people's opportunity to create their own power? If somebody could answer that, that would be helpful.
Thank you, Dave. Much appreciated. Would someone like to come in on that? Yeah. Ruth, perhaps, in fact.
Sorry, could I come back on what Ellen was talking about on the question of the wind and solar farms? I actually put that question in, and I wasn't meaning to imply that the power from the wind and solar farms should be going to AI or data centers, rather the opposite. I think this is part of an even bigger issue, which is the way that green technologies are being hijacked and are ending up putting prices up instead of bringing them down, when our prices for electricity should be falling dramatically due to use of solar and wind in particular, and also hydro and waves and so on, but sources that are effectively getting on for free. Prices should be coming down dramatically, and instead we're going to see them going up. And that the idea of having data centers and also battery farms sited near sources of green energy in order to kidnap it and make sure it doesn't get through to people who are living in cold homes is something that really needs to be exposed. And we're, Fuel Poverty Action have started this initiative called Fair Shares of Renewables, making the point of who's actually getting the benefit of green technology, so that even things that should be benefiting everybody, electric vehicles are, obviously you need to be able to afford a vehicle to begin with. Rooftop solar, a lot of people in social housing especially, but not only, people in blocks don't even get the benefit of the electricity that's produced on their own roof. And then you hear about like data centers kidnapping a large proportion of the power that's produced and pushing up prices dramatically, so that we end up paying more than we were to begin with. And I was just asking the question in that context, really, that the whole thing is something that we want to oppose all as a bloc.
Thanks, Ruth. I wonder if Mary, you might have something to say about
Sorry, I
it,
should
or
just
Andrew.
mention curtailment, because there's also the fact of lots of electricity actually being companies being paid not to produce electricity, because they'd rather pay them not to produce it than actually have it go directly to the homes where people need it. It's part of the same story.
Yeah. Thanks, Ruth. Mary, you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll come in just quickly on a few of the points raised. I guess going slightly back to the point on trade unions, I think, sorry, my cat's ripping stuff up next to me. I think generally from the interactions I've had with trade unions about the data centers is they're not that excited about them because, as Ellen kind of said, very few jobs actually come from the data centers. Some of the research around jobs I was looking at for data centers earlier in jobs is that maybe 20 jobs will come with most data centers, if that, and they're usually the lower wage janitorial type jobs. But I also think there's a real need for us, the people who are concerned about these, to be countering the jobs angles with trade unions, but also with our politicians, because just like with carbon capture, I think we're seeing the real desire to push this as a narrative that will be beneficial for everyone rather than just beneficial for the data center companies and their energy providers like Drax. So yeah, I think from my understanding of the people I've spoken to, at least, there's not really that much excitement, but there is also the arguments being put out by polluters or whoever, this is a way of protecting jobs and that kind of thing. And so I think that really we need to be countering that. Someone had also asked the question about, are these US companies or UK companies? I don't have the full stats. I think Anisha would have answered this better, but there was a very big trade deal done last year between the UK and the US, and particularly with US tech companies and the AI data center and them investing in them. So my understanding is that so many of these will be being run or being profited from by big US tech companies, and so much of our tech in this country is also just based around US tech companies anyway. So the idea that actually this is going to bring sort of real benefits to us is quite false if you look at who's investing in these data centers, who's owning them, and who will be ultimately profiting from them. And just on the wind and solar farms, sort of related to that, I guess, when I talked earlier about the AI growth zones and the bids that were being put in about those, the government did say that they were prioritizing renewable energy. When pressed, they wouldn't give any information about what that meant. But I would really echo the other points that have been made by Ruth and Ellen, that even if they are being powered by renewable energy, we shouldn't be using our limited renewable energy generating capacity on huge data centers that provide very little benefit for the vast majority of people, particularly in the way that they're being pushed at the moment, driven by big tech companies. Yeah, so just a few thoughts from me.
Thanks a lot for those thoughts, Mary. Appreciated. Vicky, you wanted to come in?
Thanks. Yes. I just recently saw an article on LinkedIn about the different types of AI, and I hadn't really fully understood, and I probably still don't really understand now, that consumer generative AI is a very different thing to the traditional, the older, smaller, leaner forms of machine learning that have been and still are really beneficial to scientific advances and medical research and stuff like that. And all this consumer generative AI is basically allowing us to not use our brains, and it's over deployed by people because it's new and it's being pushed by the AI companies who are fighting for market position or whatever. And I shared a couple of basically links to the similar sort of report in the chat, and basically the consumer generative AI is far more energy consumptive, far less has far less possibility and probability for climate benefit, solving the problems of the world, etc., etc. So we're talking about something that is basically generating big profits for tech companies and not a lot of use, considering the damage that it has the potential to cause. And I don't think, as somebody else said, I don't think that our elected representatives understand anything about this. And I certainly didn't until a couple of days ago. Yeah, I haven't got a question really, but I would be interested to know what the speakers thought of that.
Thanks a lot for that, Vicky. Much appreciated. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. You said that, Vicky, actually, because that was sort of one of the points I wanted to sort of talk about, that behind all this, I mean, I agree with everything you said, so I'm not going to repeat that. But behind all this, I think there's also a huge tie-up between fossil fuel companies and the big tech companies. And what we've been seeing for quite a few years, I mean, this is something which came up with the carbon capture thing. We've seen sort of really intense lobbying in the government by fossil fuel companies. I mean, basically, they've conned on carbon capture, they've conned governments into thinking this is something they need to do for their climate targets, and it's going to be basically a green thing, because capturing carbon sounds a good thing. But when you look at the detail of it, in most of the applications they're putting forward, all the fossil fuel ones, all the ones in burning wood, it's a really, really bad idea, and it's just creating much more emissions and locking in upstream emissions and so on. But yet, the governments have totally fallen for this. Now, I think the same thing is happening with data centers, but I also suspect that there's a whole sort of join up with data centers and fossil fuel industries. You saw that at the Trump, sort of when Trump, January 20th last year, whatever it's called, when he got sort of the presidential thing and they had all the parties. There's all the big tech bros in the parties with Trump, and the fossil fuel people funded Trump. And then you hear Trump sort of announcing, oh, like we're going to need 50 to 80 new gas-fired power stations running our lovely LNG from, our lovely gas being produced in the Permian Basin, to run all this AI. So there's clearly a big tie-up between the energy demand and keeping fossil fuels going in the system, which is what I was talking about, but I was sort of talking at a slightly micro level on it. So, what the impact is in the UK, but globally there's things. So we're really up against really, really big forces with this. But in terms of what people are saying about having a moratorium on data centers and so on, I'm sort of wondering whether, I put something in the chat on this, whether we also need to be sort of trying to pitch it somehow. I mean, it's taking on this huge thing, but trying to pitch it as, the most wasteful forms of AI, and trying to eliminate those. Because as you said, Vicky, that's actually what's being put out there for consumers with consumer generative AI. It's just all the rubbish, you see. And there needs to be much greater awareness of the energy cost of that. And somehow, if one could go for sort of restricting the really worst large language model applications which require these vast data centers, but keep there are some good uses, as you said, like the medical applications, and those have been going for years, and they just don't use the energy because they're very tightly defined models and so on. The other thing I did want to mention was the gas price thing, that again, with the pushing towards the fossil fuels and the tie-up with the fossil fuels and more gas in the system, whether it's CCS or not, we're making the energy system more dependent on gas, which is exactly what the government are saying. Ed Miliband's saying he's trying to do the opposite, because he's trying to bring prices down, because the dependency on gas basically means you're linked in the wholesale price of gas, and that's what puts the electricity up. It's when that gas is used when renewables aren't working that the gas price shoots up on the market. The grid has to buy that gas, and you get very, very expensive electricity prices as a result. And this is just going to compound that problem. So it's the exact opposite of what the government want. And I mean, that's one issue, that they're saying one thing and doing something else, but it's also the exact opposite of what we want.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Yeah, Priscilla.
Thank you very much for all this such valuable information. I was thinking of joining up with all sorts of other groups and concerns. And just one is this predicted far more use of AI is partly linked to schools and AI lessons. And for decades, we've had huge neoliberal companies like Pearson running the textbooks in schools, the lesson plans, the exam system at vast profit. And of course, they would really welcome AI lessons because it even more gets them directly in contact with the students, bypassing teachers. There's one recent study about young people's depression and anxiety is school stress exams. But also these AI lessons, they go at a certain pace. So they're too slow for lots of people and too fast for others. You can get very confused and not understand something, but the system won't respond to that. So then you can't follow the rest. But worst of all is this idea that education is knowledge transfer, impersonal, mechanical, just filling up people's brains unquestioningly, which again is extremely opposite to democratic education. We need people to ask critical questions, to be confident, to know how to interact, far more than we need to fill them up with loads and loads of data. And the AI lessons teach exactly the wrong way. It must be like being constantly on to a call center with an AI answerer trying to say, but I want this, and getting stupid no answers back. What a terrible way to treat the next generation. We should have a huge campaign to stop this. I agree that AI can be a wonderful source of information, but there should be far more agency from the students keying into things they want to discover and find out, rather than dragooning them.
Yeah, very important issue. Didn't expect to hear about at this session. Wonderful, thank you. Ruth, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just very much following on from what Priscilla said. My grandson's in one of those schools where they're more or less teaching by AI. Everything is filling out multiple choice questions. The irony is that that's exactly the sort of knowledge that is going to be replaced. You know, if you all you learn is a bunch of information, that's all you have available to offer an employer or something. The employer is going to get it better from looking it up on Google than, from an employee. It's just, it um, doesn't make sense from that point of view. And I think it's actually a real question what people think about AI as a whole now. I mean, I think a lot of people are very suspicious about mind control and, being brainwashed. And, there's a whole kind of rejection of anything, information that comes from a scientific source, or, we saw with COVID, how much people are actually suspecting what's coming out, and with good reason. Not to say everything that comes out of the establishment is lies, but an awful lot of it is. An awful lot of what comes out of AI is lies. And I think a lot of people know that more than has been acknowledged. There's a kind of an unspoken, everybody agrees with this. It would be quite important to find out what people think about AI and generative AI, what different parts of the population think about it. In terms, if we're going to be opposing it, it would be good to know what the views are. There probably has been studies done on it, but maybe nobody knows of any.
Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly an invitation for people in this room also to speak up on their views about AI in a more general sense. I think someone did did post something in the chat after your question, Ruth. You might have seen it. Have a look.
No, I didn't see it.
Yeah, have a look if you scroll up a little bit. By Katie. Yes. Thanks for posting that. It's about Europeans. Europeans agree time to put limits on big tech and data centers. Mary, you wanted to come back in?
Yeah, just briefly, I think there's been so many good points made about AI in general, and I think I just wanted to echo some of those points really that I think we can all agree that AI is not inherently bad, but it's the same as so much in our society. It's a question of who controls what and why are they controlling it, who is profiting from it. And I think under our current economic system and government, where we have so much policy pushed and designed by polluters or big tech companies whose fundamental interest is profit and not the well-being of society or our planet or anything like that, that's never going to be something that's working in our best interests. And whether that's an AI data center powered by Drax or by fossil fuels or generative AI pumping out slop that's rotting our brains, I think we have to have this understanding of the fact that under our economic system, with our current government, it's not going to be working in our best interest. But then on the other hand, there are, I think as other people have already said in the chat, so many areas where our best interests do overlap. And it almost offers an opportunity for so many different sectors of society and workers, campaigners to align on this, to demand better, to fight for better, and to try and put a stop to this sort of tech capitalism that is being pushed from every area of our establishment.
Very much for that, Mary. Yeah, totally agree. Alan?
I guess it's getting a bit away from the question of energy prices, but I do think that much as we know, we can all understand the reasons why these developments are bad for they're bad for prices, they're bad for energy consumption, they're bad for the climate, all the rest of it. But there's nothing that activates people's visceral anxiety as much as what's happening to our kids. They're really, I think there is so much real. I mean, I have young grandchildren as well, and at the minute, so far they're young enough that we can place controls over what they see and what they do and what they play with and things, and they're not. But it's yeah. What it makes me think about is the tie-in with other things, like parents no longer have time to spend with their children because the benefit system forces us all to work all day and all night, and then it obviously then blames the parents and the families when the kids are not school ready, when they start school at 5 and they haven't got basic skills, and the knock-on effects of that, or parents get blamed for sticking their kids in front of a device because they haven't got the time and the energy to interact with them. But there's a how long ago is it now? 35 years ago. I can't believe how long ago. It's a long time ago when they first introduced the SATs, which was when my daughter was at primary school. And parents organised. A lot of parents took their kids out of school. Parents organised meetings and protests and things. It didn't work. I mean, we lost. But the thing is, you don't see that now because parents have been disempowered by things, by the changing conditions of employment and the changing requirements on parents are blamed for everything, but at the same time parenting is not deemed as work, or it's just deemed as something that gets in the way of going to work. So yeah, I mean, I'm just throwing that in because I think that we have to address the barriers to people and communities actually getting up and saying no to these things, despite the fact that are so people are so anxious and frightened, that equally feeling disempowered and hopeless.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Dave saying there's too much apathy and no critical thinking amongst communities in response to that, Helen. Thank you everyone for your contributions to this discussion. There's clearly just been so much engagement with this session. Thank you all for your comments, your links. Would anyone like to come in to speak up in the final minutes here of the session?
Yeah, can I just mention, Andrew's drawn our attention to a sort of coming sort of crunch point in terms of what's happening with the government considering it. And I think that's a takeaway from this meeting, really, that we should all think about how we might be able to contribute to putting pressure on at that particular point. Did you say June, Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, Ed Miliband has to set the seventh carbon budget by, I know, something like June the 20th. I know NISA is saying that they're already asking parliamentary questions and things, and that's sort of helpful putting some pressure on. But I mean, I think pressure through MPs and things would be good, and also through campaigns on, on this setting of the seventh carbon budget, particularly as the Committee on Climate Change just don't seem to have considered AI properly in any of their in the document. It's not even mentioned in a 400-page document. So I think there's serious issues there which we can should be able to really highlight through campaigns. And if anybody here from campaign wants to get involved in that, I'd be happy to talk more about that. Maybe we should have a session on how to challenge the seventh carbon budget, both on carbon capture, actually, because I've been thinking about that for months, but also now on data centers, which pushes all the gas and carbon capture and biomass and everything anyway. Basically the carbon budgets don't add up, and the government aren't being honest about that. That's the bottom line of it. And this is just another way that they don't add up. But everything like data centers just makes the situation worse. So it's more than a crunch in a way. It's just going to become a catastrophe really. But around about 2030, going to find that nothing adds up in what they've been doing for the whole decade on energy, in my view.
It seems like the kind of thing that might be worth one of those sort of Action Network campaigns where everybody's asked to write to their MP, and that's facilitated through Action Network. And I don't, from what I know of what FPA's got on our plates at the moment, I think it's highly unlikely that we'd be able to organize that as one organization. But if there were a meeting like you suggest, Andrew, I'm sure we'd support it. And, probably campaign against climate change, and others here would as well. And I know it is work, but it's not a huge impossible task to actually get some steam up about it.
Yeah.
So that MPs actually hear from constituents about it.
I agree, and I saw Ellen's smile there when you said campaign against climate change. Well, I was thinking, given the webinar 2 nights ago, I was thinking they might be able to help sort of with some of the mechanics of that, and also perhaps Global Action Plan and Foxglove and people should get those in. I mean, they're probably already doing a lot of parliamentary work anyway, but
yeah, but just something to engage members of the public who probably don't know about it.
oh, Ellen's saying, well, Ellen, you say what you've put in the chat.
Well, can I just say, yeah, I'm not sure I don't think there's anybody else here from the Campaign Against Climate Change steering group, but I'm pretty sure that as a group we're, all of a similar mind about it. So it's something that we could legitimately do as an action, is get something up on Action Network, but also as part of the Trade Union Year of Climate Action, we have the idea has been floated that we should have like a full, not just an hour and a half like this, but a day meeting in person, perhaps, where we could look at all the, the energy implications, the fuel poverty implications, the jobs and employment implications, as education, all these different concerns. We'd have space to kind of bring those in and air them. I mean, that's there's nothing definite on that, but I'm really, the more I hear, the more I'm there's an appetite for that, isn't there? So hopefully we can do something, and not just like, it could be co-hosted by several organizations potentially.
I think that there could be an advantage in making it not about the seventh carbon budget generally, but about AI in particular. I understand, Andrew, why you would want to have CCS in it as well. But I think it's hard for people to grasp more than one thing at a time. And I think AI in itself is something that people are concerned about because of all the education stuff and different aspects of it. And we might do better to focus on that at this point. Make it a bit less abstract for people. And do a joint thing if somebody can pull it together.
Yes, Ellen did mention this idea for convening a bigger, longer meeting. Yeah, that would be brilliant. That would be brilliant. I'm Ellen. I have yet to get back to your email, but I can tell you I love the idea already. Thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, for your participation, and also and again to all our speakers for making it so informative. My colleague Hannah has linked a few things in the chat. If you haven't already, a link to sign the Energy for All petition. There's also a link there to become a member of Fuel Poverty Action. If you want to join us in campaigning for every household to have enough energy to cover their basic needs, you are most welcome. And there's also a link to give us some feedback on this session. I will be sharing this recording and all the links from the chat through our mailing list. They will also go up on our website, and the recording itself will be on our YouTube channel too. So keep an eye on all those channels for those things. But for now, let's say good night. If you're able, please unmute yourselves, turn your camera on, and yeah, just wish everyone a good evening. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks
Good
for organising.
evening. Thanks a lot for organising.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.